Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Donnie Greenwald, and I serve as co-chair of the Associated's Insight Israel Forum along with Tammy Heyman and Gary Olshansky. We gather today after a turbulent month of significant pain and loss to the Jewish people. As Israel finds itself in the throes of war, our hearts are all with all those who are mourning the loss of innocent loved ones by unspeakable terror, all the hostages whose fate is unknown, as well as those who are now fighting for Israel on the front lines. Before we proceed, let us take a moment to remember and honor all the victims of this recent terror. Thank you. Even in the face of incomprehensible pain, mourning, and fear, our Jewish community here in Baltimore remains steadfast in our support of our Jewish family in Israel. Over the years, we have built bridges, created bonds, invested in friendships, and stood together with our family in Israel, particularly with our partner city of Ashkelon, with whom we are celebrating 20 years of partnership. Our connections continue to grow even during challenging times. One such advocate for connecting the Baltimore Jewish community to Israel is Sue Glick Liebman, who we are happy to be honoring tonight. Sue is a lifelong advocate for Israel and has led countless initiatives that have allowed the Baltimore Jewish community to connect with Israel. Please give a warm welcome to Sue as we honor her tireless efforts to strengthening the Jewish people this evening.
I want to thank you for coming tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces that makes me really feel good that you all came. And I want to welcome Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, who is our esteemed speaker tonight, and we're so proud to have him here. As you saw in my bio, I've had a strong passion for Israel my whole life. You are all here tonight because you also share that connection. To quote the first scholar who we had for this program, Avram Infeld, "This is important to every Jew. You don't come to Israel just to take tour of another country. You come to Eretz Israel to tour your soul, and come here to meet the place that turned your family of refugees into a family that will never again be a refugee. You cannot remain a people today without a state in which your people are sovereign." Although Avram said these things several years ago, it's never more important than it is right now. I've never heard Dr. Kurtzer myself, but everyone who has is very impressed. On a personal note, 2 of my grandsons are graduates of the Hartman School in Jerusalem, which I didn't tell you yet. I look forward to hearing his message tonight, and I'm sure we will all leave here tonight with an even stronger commitment to the land and the people of Israel. Thank you.
I was going to jump off the stage, but I think that would have made things worse. So.
Got it.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you for many years of extraordinary service to the Baltimore Jewish community. The Inside Israel Forum is so honored to be able to continue your legacy with the Sue Glick Liebman Israel Scholar Program. 5 years ago, the Inside Israel Forum was created to enable community leaders to engage with Israel as Americans and Jews, to address polarization, and as a space to tackle diverse viewpoints about Israel together with esteemed educators and experts in the field. Now, more than ever, the forum is an important resource for our community. It's my privilege to introduce our esteemed scholar, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. Yehuda is regarded as one of contemporary Judaism's leading thought leaders and is a true beacon of wisdom and hope for our time. We are so thankful that he has joined us in Baltimore as a Sue Glick Liebman Israel Scholar. It's my pleasure to welcome Yehuda Kurtzer.
Excuse me. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. And thank you. It's inspiring to be in your presence, and thank you for this. You know, I speak for a living. It's what I do. I teach, I give lectures, I host podcasts. For the past month, I've done about 3 of these a day because our community, more than anything else right now, seems to want 2 things. It wants to come together. Synagogue attendance is at like a record high over the past month. That tells us something about what the Jewish people tend to need in a time like this. And the second thing that our community has signaled that it needs and wants right now is wisdom. And I think there's a difference between analysis and wisdom. Maybe we all are also reading for a lot of analysis, political analysis, updates, etc. But that is oftentimes unsatisfying. It leaves us more uncertain about the future. You can keep reading and still not know what's going to happen tomorrow. But the search for wisdom is a little different. It's a little bit of the question not of what's going to happen tomorrow or what happened today, but what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of community do we want to be? And what does it mean for us to engage seriously with the things that we consider to be our ultimate commitments? And with all of that, I will say since October 7th, it's been very hard to figure out how to start any of these lectures and conversations. I can tell you that the Insight Israel Forum, I got that right? The Insight Israel Forum would have felt very different if this event was held on October 5th. The conversation was fundamentally different for 10 months, and I'll come back to this. Israel has been torn apart by the question of its democracy, and I think that was like the original thing I was supposed to come speak about. And for the past month, not only was October 7th the single, and I'll expand on this more, the single most significant trauma as a Jew that I've experienced in my lifetime, and that perhaps our people have experienced at least since the Yom Kippur War and maybe further back. But we find ourselves right now at this profound intersection between a trauma that feels still ripe and significant for many of us, a trauma that continues to unfold for Israelis, especially the families whose loved ones are still held hostage, the families who are not sure whether their loved ones are held hostage or dead and unrecognizable. And on the same time, we are on the precipice of enormous uncertainty, a war that could go on for quite a long time, and a war that has opened up a set of vulnerabilities and fears that may be with the Jewish people and the state of Israel for quite some time. The first week or 2 following October 7th, I felt as though we were in a different moment in Jewish time than I've ever particularly experienced on the collective level. Actually, I found myself in Israel on October 14th. I happened to have had a ticket to Israel, and it happened to have been on El Al. And so I was like, of course I'm going to go. Our family actually has a rule, which is we don't not go to Israel. So I went. And I experienced something in Israel that I've seen many, many times on an individual level, but I've never seen on a collective level, which is what it looks like for an entire society to be in Shiva. In fact, I felt like actually this metaphor about Shiva has carried very powerfully for this whole month. The first couple of days following October 7th, if you are like me, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what to think. I just wept. I doom-scrolled, tried to contact my relatives, and I was heartened or encouraged by knowing that there's actually a category for that in Jewish tradition, which is called to be an onain. If you have a deceased relative in front of you and they're not buried yet, you're actually exempted from all sorts of Jewish obligations because the tradition can't imagine that you have the presence of mind or focus to be able to pray or to put on tefillin, to recite the Shema. So the tradition basically frees you up. You have no obligations. And I felt like the first few days, we were all in that weird liminal state. And then we went into a collective Shiva. In Israel, Shiva was an actual experience for thousands of Israelis. I know even the number 1,400, which seems enormous, becomes much bigger when you actually calculate how many people were directly mourners. So let's assume 6 mourners per dead, which I think is a conservative estimate. Now the number of people sitting Shiva is way in the thousands. And then take all of the friends and next door neighbors who, as we all know, are responsible for cultivating the Shiva atmosphere. And literally tens of thousands of Israelis were in and out of Shiva houses. But on top of that, it actually felt like the entire society felt like a Shiva house. It was quieter. The hours on restaurants were limited, partly because so many men were at war. But also it was that thing, like the synagogue says, Shiva hours are 10 to 2. So I would walk by like a jewelry store. It says, today our hours are 10 to 2. And it felt like you were entering into a Shiva. And today, as we mark the Shloshim, I feel like the metaphor of that story for the Jewish people continues to unfold. Now, what happens when Shiva ends? We don't actually say the phrase, Shiva ends. We say, I got up from Shiva. You know why we say, I got up from Shiva instead of Shiva ends? Because Shiva ends conveys this sense that somehow the period of grief is over. But getting up from Shiva is a way of saying, I'm now carrying the grief with me, but I'm going to have to find a way to incorporate, to assimilate that grief and that trauma in going back to doing my life, in re-entering the world. I find it to be an extraordinarily compassionate phrase when we say, I got up from Shiva, because we're allowing a mourner to still be mourning, because we're human beings. We don't end our mourning simply because a ritual has circumscribed the time that's available to us. So now we as a people are getting up from the Shloshim. We as a people are figuring out what emerges and what comes next. We still find ourselves between trauma and uncertainty and are trying to figure out what is next. Much of that uncertainty is caught up in the fact that it's also very hard to know where to look. You feel like an irresponsible watcher of Israel if you're entirely focused on the southern border and the fight in Gaza right now, and not also paying attention to the northern border, or to Yemen, or to anti-Semitism in America, or to the situation on Instagram or on the college campus. There are all these different sites that are challenging us to figure out a sense of who we are and what we're supposed to think about all of this complex reality right now. One option is that we continue to doom scroll, which many of us do. One option is that we check out. Ruth Messenger from American Jewish World Service has a beautiful line about what it means to be responsible. And she says, we don't have the luxury of being overwhelmed. To claim I'm overwhelmed is actually a statement of privilege. It's a way of saying, okay, this will get dealt with by others. I'm overwhelmed and I'm not responsible. It's just not a Jewish thing to do. And for many of us, for all of us in the room who care about the Jewish people, who care about the state of Israel, we are at the precipice of really having to figure out who do we want to be right now, what are our communities supposed to stand for, and where are we supposed to focus our attention. So tonight, I want to offer a framework as we come out of the Shloshim for us to think about what does it mean for us to be moral actors and moral people wrestling with the sheer impossibility of what we have been watching and confronting over the past month. I want to offer you something unusual. I want to call it a moral map, a way of analyzing multiple different conversations or commitments that we're going to have to hold at the same time as we figure out how to lead our communities through this very difficult moment. Some of the commitments I'm going to share tonight on this moral map, you are going to agree with. You're going to say, yes, I feel that very deeply, and others are going to push you. And I'm going to ask you at the end of my remarks tonight for us to explore what does it feel like to hold all of these commitments together, that all of these moral commitments taken together help us to envision a totally different and much more profound way to be in relationship with the Jewish people and the state of Israel. I want to suggest 4 sites on this map, 4 continents of moral commitments. The first is one that was the first instinct of many of us in Jewish life, and a test that I'm surprised that we passed. The first moral commitment that I want us to think about is what we'll call, if you like the term peoplehood, that's fine. The second term you might use is solidarity. My colleagues and I at Hartman for decades have been worried about whether the solidarity muscle of the Jewish people still worked. There were a lot of indications that it had atrophied. The passion and commitment to Israel among American Jews is less than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And if anything, actually, Israel is as divisive a force in Jewish life as it is an organizing force in Jewish life. And many of us, for me, having not grown up through 1967, or perhaps the last great organizing moment for the State of Israel and world Jewry, which was the rescue in Entebbe on July 4th of 1976. I was born in January of 1977. My life has been filled not with moments that mobilized Jewish collective support for Israel, but moments that eroded Jewish collective support for Israel. Lebanon wars, intifadas, even the peace process, assassination of a prime minister, and so on, wars in Gaza, and so on and so forth. Was the solidarity muscle going to actually kick in the ways that I felt like my ancestors talked about, where our tradition tells us that there's a thing that when the Jewish people are suffering, you are supposed to feel pain. And whether you actually feel pain or whether you ritualize the experience of feeling pain doesn't really matter. You're supposed to be able to have that muscle that when they suffer, we suffer. When they grieve, we grieve. The trauma to one of us is a trauma that hits all of us. I worried I might not see it in my lifetime. Actually, I think the last great solidarity moment for American Jews was probably the Soviet Jewry March on Washington, right? And the perverse thing about the nostalgia for that is that, like, the Jewish people need a whole bunch of people to be imprisoned in order for us to feel a sense of solidarity for one another. But extraordinarily, and I was blown away by this, it turns out that the solidarity muscle for the Jewish people remained pretty strong. And we could see it in our communities, both on the emotional level. I went to shul the Shabbat after, maybe it was 2 weeks after October 7th, and the entire place was weeping. A shul that has had controversies and different opinions about Israel, and the whole shul was weeping. So we saw it emerge on an emotional level in community. We've seen it in the ways that people are showing up in ways we haven't seen in a long time. We see it in how one of the activities that American Jews do to display our solidarity, to show that it has teeth, is we actually open up our pocketbooks. American Jewish, I don't know what the number is today. Maybe somebody from the Associated knows. As of a couple of days ago, they had started on a campaign to raise $500 million to support Israelis right now. These are like 1947 numbers that the Jewish community was able to do. They blew past 500 million. I think they're at probably 650 million now. And if you take the sum total, not just of what's been raised through the federation system, but Friends of the IDF and plenty of other organizations, and even all of the amount of money that was just sent by people via Venmo because somebody said, I'm sending a duffel bag full of socks. If you take all of that, you're talking probably at about $1 billion of the Jewish community in North America saying, we are implicated in this and we express our solidarity. We showed up through advocacy. It's still extraordinary to me. So much noise gets associated with 10 members of Congress in the Democratic Party that we miss the fact that 420 members of Congress on both parties are basically uniform in terms of their support for Israel right now. That is a product of extraordinary political advocacy and success, and perhaps even just the activity that gets the least amount of press about how we show up is that we scream, we cry, we raise our voice, and we pray. Those are powerful activities. There was a lot more media attention devoted to 1,000 Jews at a pro-Palestine rally in Washington, far more than was devoted to 142 local rallies by pro-Israel Jews around the country, which represented a vastly higher percentage of who American Jews actually are. If one item on the moral agenda for us is the question of what does solidarity obligate? What does peoplehood demand of us? I think we passed the test of phase 1, and I'm not sure we're going to pass the test of phase 2. Solidarity instinct starts to erode when people start to ask, okay, I'm with my people, but I also have other moral instincts that are telling me I'm not sure if I like everything that my people is doing. You could see it happen almost instantly when there was that first, turns out to be false news report. Israel bombed a hospital. Suddenly, these things don't merely have an effect on how we understand fact and fiction. They actually go deeply to our compassionate hearts. They say to us, I know I'm supposed to be on this side, but am I on the wrong side? Those kinds of moments have the effect of threatening and eroding a question of solidarity. I don't know right now whether the American Jewish gesture towards solidarity, towards peoplehood, can actually sustain its allies. We're seeing a whole set of challenges for American Jews and our allies, and many American Jews are ultimately going to choose their allies over their commitment to their community. That is happening already and is going to continue to happen. Does an instinct towards solidarity make us want to push out all of the other Jews who disagree with us? Or does it make us realize in moments like this that we are stronger when we figure out how to behave as one organism and manage difference of opinion within that organism? So item number 1 on the moral map. What is future of solidarity going to look like for us as Jews in America in relationship to the state of Israel and to one another? Item number 2 on that map is Jewish power. I wrote a piece early in the war, maybe a few days after the war started, in which I argued that the state of Israel is fighting a just war. What I mean by that is, according to the ethics of war tradition, there are 2 big questions about justice in war, ethics of war. One of them is the war itself just? Is it legitimate? And the second set of questions are you conducting the war justly? I said, we as a community have to get behind a commitment that this is actually a just war. I wrote specifically to liberal rabbis, because I said, you're going to be tested instantly. When you watch the casualty rates go higher for Gazan civilians than you see for Israeli civilians, when you see a pacifistic instinct that is prominent among liberal Jewry, when you see a lot of people who don't know what the phrase ethics of war actually means, terms like proportionality in war, which are actually guidelines to make a set of ultimately hard decisions, you're going to see erosion of a commitment to that. And what that will awaken for many Jews is a kind of squeamishness around Jewish power. A lot of diaspora Jews have a squeamishness around Jewish power. I'm okay with enough of it, but I don't want it to be our brand. Now, I'm guessing if you come to the Inside Israel Forum at the Associated, you are on the less squeamish side of a relationship to Jewish power. But I want to tell you, you're holding on to a position that is actually very hard for many liberal Jews to sustain. Some of this is because of proximity to other faith traditions and their own ambivalences about the exercise of power. But the State of Israel came along and brought about an interpretive revolution in Jewish thought. It said to the Jewish people, there is dignity in power, there is a morality in self-defense, and there's a tradition that I can identify that tells me that this is okay. So the first step that we had to do in response to this war is say this is a just war, and then we earn the right to be critics at times when we think that the war is not being prosecuted justly. But there's a world of difference between if you say, I don't think this is a just war, and therefore anything the State of Israel is doing is illegitimate, and what I think is good criticism, I think this is a just war, but I wish they did this and not that. That's the space, and it's a narrow one, for us as American Jews to be able to hold a sophisticated attitude that our tradition does not valorize powerlessness, a sophisticated understanding that just because Israel is more powerful than the Palestinians does not mean that the position of Hamas right now is a more morally serious one than that of the State of Israel. That we are not morally compromised by wielding power, and that at the same time, we are morally responsible to be conversation partners and sometimes critics that bring our people and our state in relationship to that same ethics of war tradition. There is dignity that comes with a Jewish narrative of power, and there are obligations. Number one, peoplehood and solidarity. Number two, second item on the moral map, what does it look like for us to really be conversant with a Torah of Jewish power? The third item on this moral map is what I want to call, uncomfortably, sovereignty. I think you used this phrase, sovereignty, actually, right? Quoting Avram Infeld. Sovereignty is this extraordinary gift that the Jewish people got in 1948. It's the most dramatic change that the Jewish people had in our history. You get to be in charge. Good news and bad news. You're in charge. And you are responsible. When you're in charge, you cannot allow a whole bunch of things to take place under your authority and claim you're not responsible. Right now, in the past 3 weeks, as most of us have been focused on our beloved friends and family fighting a just war in Gaza, my best friend signed up for the military 3 years after his reserve duty had ended, and I just wait daily for a WhatsApp check-in. I'm out. My nephew as well, on the front line. As we are watching that story, multiple other incredibly dangerous stories have been unfolding in the State of Israel, one of which is a massive rise in settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, driven by arsonists in the Israeli government who want to create another front of this war between Israelis and Palestinians and between Jews and Muslims so that they can evict Palestinians from their homes. That's what they want to do. And meanwhile, an incredibly dangerous situation that has emerged for Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are 20% of the Israeli populace, who are now under enormous suspicion for their opinions and for their loyalties, who are being threatened by a police ministry that is run by a Kahanist. These are the responsibilities of sovereignty. To talk about these things is not anti-Zionist. It is the opposite. It's what Zionism is. It's we are sovereign, and therefore we are responsible. You know, the Torah tells us, if there's a dead body found in the land of Israel between two towns, and you don't know who was responsible for it, the town that's closer has to come and wash its hands over it and take responsibility for the presence of just a dead body in its midst. What happens when a Jewish society has bad actors speaking on behalf of Zionism and the Jewish people doing these types of things in our midst? The most dangerous possible situation that could emerge right now is that a legitimate war between Hamas and the State of Israel turns into a war between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people, or between Jews and Muslims. Those are nightmare scenarios to which we are ultimately accountable. And this, to me, this is like the dream Zionism dreamed of problems like this. We get to be in charge. But now we're in charge. So item number 3 on our moral map, after solidarity and after really reckoning with what does it mean to have a Jewish narrative of power, is sovereignty. What does it mean to be responsible for a society? There's something deeply diasporic about a people that can only talk about its own victimhood. That's not what the State of Israel came to do. The State of Israel came along and said, this is not just our story anymore. You are the responsible party. The 4th item on that moral map is the topic that I was meant to talk about on October 6th, which is democracy. This is one of the most fascinating things to watch in Israel right now, is that Israelis are equally angry at their government as they were prior to October 7th. 65 to 70% of Israelis oppose the campaign of judicial reform that the Netanyahu administration was trying to push through. 65 to 70% of Israelis. My friends, you know Israelis. You could not get 65% of Israelis to agree that it's raining right now. 65 to 70% of Israelis have been talking about democracy. My colleagues and I have felt that we are on the precipice of an opportunity that the State of Israel has not had for 75 years, that if 65% of the country is talking about democracy, we could actually lean in and build it. 65 to 70% of people are talking about civil rights and human rights. There was a massive window of opportunity. That window has not changed. In fact, this is amazing to watch. But some of the same individuals in Israel who were leading the protest movement against the government are now leading the social relief efforts to support families from the South. And if you ask them, I did on one of my podcasts, if you ask them what changed, they said nothing. They said the reality is, I don't think I have a functioning government. So beforehand, I was protesting against it, and now I'm doing their job. So they haven't changed their attitudes about the problematics of Israeli democracy. They just feel that the front line of what it means to be a citizen right now has changed. They're sending their sons to battle. They are fighting for democracy, and they are taking care of their fellow citizens. They are modeling a better version of Israeli society than the one that we currently have. We are in the midst of a massive referendum on leadership in the State of Israel and for the Jewish people, and we are going to witness the question of whether we, as lovers and supporters of the State of Israel, are going to be allies to our Israeli friends in their quest for democracy, or if we're going to get in their way. If we're going to insist on a language of solidarity that actually impedes their ability to bring about leadership and social change. Let me go one step further on that. Many of us still believe that the strongest guarantor for safety and security long-term for Jews in Israel is safety and security long-term for Palestinians. Many of us still believe that. And the best tools and the best values that our people have ever had to think about that dynamic are the tools and values of liberal democracy. It's true in Israel, and it's true here. The strongest tools and values we have at our disposal to fight anti-Semitism in this country are building a stronger and healthier and more robust liberal democracy. That will make us safer and will make other people safer. So all of these things are intertwined with one another as part of what it means to stand in relationship with Israel and the Jewish people right now. See, the risk that I think we have is that we are going to decide on one. We're going to be committed to one of these. By the way, if you liked one of them more than others, I could probably tell you what your politics are. Which version of Israel you think you want to prioritize right now. I'm not sure that that actually helps a complicated state of Israel that is navigating its way through all of these stories. If you pick one, you're kind of a fundamentalist to that position. if you pick two, because they line up quite nicely, peoplehood and power are a little bit more on the right, sovereignty and democracy are a little bit more on the left. Well, you're not a fundamentalist, but you're a partisan. You want this story more than you want this other story. But part of what it means to be the Jewish people with a complicated state, and one that we are proud of and that we want to thrive, is to understand the deep interdependence between all of these moral commitments. That to really be an aspiration for the light unto the nations that we want the state of Israel to be, a source of pride for us morally, something that we feel connected to, something that thrives not only for the Jewish people, but for all of its inhabitants, is going to require that all four of these moral commitments swim together as part of a complex whole. I oftentimes feel that we are like inheritors of our ancestors' nightmares. We carry that narrative of victimhood and vulnerability epigenetically in our souls. I'm a fourth generation American on all sides. All four of my grandparents were born in America. It didn't mean I didn't have Holocaust nightmares, because trauma and vulnerability and victimhood are epigenetic and not merely genetic. They travel through our education systems and our value systems. We are the inheritors of their nightmares. And at the same time, we are the bearers of power and privilege at this moment in Jewish history that would have been the stuff of their dreams. What an extraordinary thing to be able to be in position of both. Our ancestors would have known the vulnerability story, but could not have imagined the statehood story. They would have understood the vulnerability story of diaspora, but would never have fathomed an American Jewish community that can raise $650 million in 2 weeks. It can't process that. We've had a little bit of an awakening over the past couple of weeks of the narrative of trauma and vulnerability. Now it's no longer epigenetic for some of us. Now it's our lived experience. But one doesn't obviate the other. We don't simply say, how do I lean back into my victimhood and vulnerability when I have a state of Israel, the stuff of our dreams, that is capable of shaping its own destiny? Zionism, folks, Zionism was the Jewish people's great project of imagination. In the span of 50 years, it went from being a pipe dream to an actual thing. We, as partners to the state of Israel, as diaspora Jews, should be conversation partners with Israel about rehabilitating its moral imagination, because ultimately, none of us get to choose what era of Jewish history we are born into. The only thing we get to choose is which kind of Jews we want to be in the era of Jewish history in which we are born. We are at a massive turning point for the Jewish people and its relationship to the state of Israel. We are at Israel at 75, a massive turning point for Israel itself. And I pray for us that we can be the moral conversation partners, thinkers, dreamers, and imaginers that the Jewish people require from us right now. Thank you very much.
Hi, we have time for a couple questions for Dr. Kurtzer. If anyone has, I will come bring you the microphone.
Hi, Dr. Kurtzer. I'm Jacob. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. It's really awesome to hear you speak. So maybe this is something that I know I'm struggling with. I hope that other people are sort of going through something similar. But I think we're all involved in different organizations and have different spheres of influence that we get to be a part of. And one thing that I'm trying to do very hard is struggling with, what's the right approach, is how to get groups that aren't strictly Jewish. I happen to be an attorney, and I'm very involved with the Bar Association, just by example, but I'm sure there's people from all sorts of different professions and in all sorts of different spheres that want to bring a message or have that group be involved in some way. And what's your advice on how to involve those groups?
Great. This goes to the question of kind of allyship, which I will say has been very, very hard. It's been hard for me. I've had a set of our Hartman Institute's been doing interfaith work for decades, and I feel like most of the success of that work eroded in the past 3 weeks. It's just been astonishing to watch. I think there are two big burdens on us, or ways to approach the question of allyship going forward. One of them is the Jewish people's relationship to the State of Israel is so profoundly misunderstood by most of our allies as being one of two things. It's either, well, you're Jewish and there's a lot of Jews there, and therefore, like, it's, you're connected by virtue of shared religion, or you simply care about the politics of the State of Israel. And in both cases, those are positions that are very easy to erode, right? Because, okay, but don't your Jewish values require you to hold to a different standard? And why do you like those kind of Bibi, Trump, Putin politics? Aren't you on the other side? Right, so when it's politics or it's religion, it doesn't really work. Whereas for most of us Jews, our relationship to the State of Israel is not about politics, and it's not really about religion. It's about this weird thing called peoplehood, which is kind of like a secular Jewish commitment that is a way in which we understand our Jewishness. I think we have overwhelmingly failed to explain to others what our relationship to the State of Israel is about. So if I was going to reset the whole map, I would say that has to be one of the key pieces of this work. And a second thing I want us to think about is contracting. What do I mean by this? I had a professional coach some years ago who said to me, the bulk of misunderstandings in a workplace are the result of unarticulated requests. I wanted you to do something a particular way. You didn't do it that way, partly because I never told you. And then when you didn't do it, I was mad at you. It's like a totally absurd setup. And this actually runs through interfaith, intergroup, and allyship stuff all the time. I'm talking to you about a whole bunch of other things, but I haven't really told you what I need from you. I haven't really told you how I want you to show up. We haven't really stipulated what are the terms that we actually owe to one another. So the first point I'm making is a big one. We have to get clearer about what our tether is to the State of Israel, and then be clearer educationally. And then we have to do some more explicit contracting. And I'll just give you one last comment on this. The first thing I was upset about with interfaith allies for the first 2 weeks of this war was why nobody called. Nobody called. I couldn't understand it. I was like, I'm sitting Shiva. Nobody came to Shiva. And by the way, you can skip the wedding, but don't skip the Shiva. Right? That's when you're supposed to show up. And I said, I couldn't believe they didn't come. And I did a little bit of like a virtue ethics thing on myself. I was like, Yehuda, you didn't always go to Shiva. Stop holding people accountable to something that they might not know what they were supposed to do, and that's not really the issue. What I'm more upset now is that I thought that there were aspects of the contracting that was more transparent. And that's where I feel much more let down. So if we're going to rebuild this culture, we're going to have to work that way on two different fronts. Hope that makes sense.
I spoke to Avram today, and he made the statement, which I think we all know. Anti-Semitism is not against Israel. It's against all the Jews. And for us to, how do we tackle that?
Ooh. Yeah. Well, I'll say a couple things. One is, as I alluded to before, I first of all, in general, I don't think great hatreds are eradicatable. I don't. You're not going to convince people of a deeply held belief that's actually carried sway for thousands of years to just set apart these hatreds. You can't. What you can do is build healthier societies that make these hatreds considered unpalatable more broadly. You can create the conditions in which those types of hatreds are viewed as things that aren't allowed in polite company, that aren't allowed in universities, aren't allowed in systems. And therefore, that's why I said earlier, a stronger, more robust liberal democracy in this country would be more capable of being resilient against anti-Semitism and structural racism and Islamophobia and all these other things. So paradoxically, it means you kind of have to lean out of, how do I as a Jew convince you not to hate me? And instead, how do I build a healthier society in which those types of hatreds are considered unacceptable? And I think the second thing is, and this I feel very strongly, anti-Semitism is not a problem for Jews to solve. We didn't create it, and we are not its perpetrators. It's actually someone else's problem to solve. And that's why it goes back to questions of allyship, relationship building, institutions and infrastructures in America. You know, the American liberal democracy was held for a long time by 3 sets of institutions in this country which were viewed as being above pettiness. The universities, the media, and the federal government. So you want to say, what's the agenda to address anti-Semitism and hate in this country? Those 3 things. And it's not, that is big, that is way bigger than us. Yeah.
I ask your advice as a fellow educator.
Yeah.
Until October 6th, we had been engaged in teaching everybody that Jewish living in relationship to Israel was broad and deep. And now we are in a state of trauma and politics and being military analysts. Help me. What do I tell my students?
First of all, you are not a military analyst. And so don't try to be one, right? You can help your students learn how to be critical thinkers as they consume media, which could include military analysis. That's a skill that educators have. How do you continue to grow as a critical thinker, as a passionate Jew, as a moral person? But don't stop doing that. Actually, we had a colleague at Hartman some years ago, a rabbi, congregational rabbi, who wrote a great piece in the Times of Israel in 2013. He was like, I don't understand why people think that going to rabbinical school should make you an expert on Iranian centrifuges. And actually, the reason why that had happened was because actually there was a weird dynamic between rabbis and congregants around the expectation of what the rabbi is supposed to be an expert about. So I tried this amazing experiment a few years ago in Denver. We brought together community leaders who were presidents of shuls and the rabbis. And we had a whole learning session about the way that politics erodes Jewish community. And then one of the lay leaders stood up and said, I don't understand why my rabbi always talks about politics from the bima. It was like, okay, now we're on something. And then the rabbi of his shul stood up and said, I don't understand why my congregants want me to talk about politics all the time from the bima. So I use that as an example to say, your students don't want you to be a military analyst. They want you to be a person who teaches them critical thinking, empathy, compassion, deep Jewish values like the ones we talked about today. And at the same time, if you create space for them to ask questions about what you know and don't know, you can sometimes say, well, I have an opinion about this, and it's this. And sometimes say, I don't know. And it's interesting. If you're a Talmud teacher, like the 2 best things that can happen in a Talmud class, I teach Talmud too. The 2 best things that can happen in a Talmud class are your students get into an argument, or they ask you an incredible question that you don't know the answer to. You do those 2 things, 2 things happen, you're like, I am the world's greatest Talmud teacher. My students are passionate, they're creative. In an Israel studies classroom, both of those outcomes are considered failures. So we have to change the whole dynamic. The hardest group I've taught in the past month, my wife is a head of a day school. And she's like, Yehuda, can you come speak to the middle schoolers? And I was like, okay, what am I going to say to them? She said, just answer questions. So it was amazing. They had 25 different questions. Sometimes I was like, I'm not the right person to ask this question. This is what I know, and this is where to go. But mostly they wanted to be held. They wanted to know that adults were able to talk to them. They had fantastic questions. Why doesn't Israel do this? And what's the deal with the battleships in the Mediterranean? And where is Gaza? So like there was that. What it really was about was, do I trust you as a learner to ask a question? And do you trust me as a teacher to be the person who's holding you? And that's a lot, actually, right now.
Thank you very much for your expert comments. You touched on one thing that has aggravated me a great deal, and that is how terms are misunderstood by social media: apartheid, colonialism, aggression, victimhood. I mean, terms are somehow twisted and turned upside down.
Yeah, well, social media is an immoral cesspool of disinformation. A nicer way to say that is social media is not an altruistically motivated industry. It is a profit-motivated industry. And therefore, all of the companies who produce social media technologies are doing so to enrich attention to their platforms, create addiction to those platforms, and keep people within echo chambers of things that they already believe. I didn't make any of that up. That's just basically fact. So one thing to do is to say, how do I get into those spaces and fix them? Increasingly, I kind of feel like Israel must win the war against Hamas. Israel must win a war against its demons. American Jews must win a battle against anti-Semites. I'm not sure we are going to win a battle for social media, hearts and minds, and I'm not sure we have to. And so it might require of us to take different approaches, including teaching our kids how to be resilient, teaching them to understand why social media is the way it is. There was a little reported news story that the vast, vast majority of what is on social media right now, the pro-Palestinian side of social media, is coming directly out of Iran, Russia, and China. So we have to just teach our children that's what you're experiencing. It's easier said than done. I have 2 teenage boys. I told them, I was like, guys, I need you to take Instagram and TikTok off your phones. They laughed at me, obviously. And I was like, but you're going to be exposed to a whole bunch of things that you don't want to see. And they were just like, we won't look at it. And I was like, that's not going to work. We have to figure out another way to build resilience and critical thinking skills instead of trying to figure out how do we stick more hasbara on these sites to get people to speak the truth. I just think it's a losing battle.
Hi, I'm Buffy Minkin. Hi. Quick question for you. I know in the past that Shalom Hartman worked pretty heavily in the university sector with bringing some educational materials and products out to the professors and universities. Are you still doing that? If not, what are your thoughts on what's going on campuses right now, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I think this is important. There are 2 stories about what's going on campus, what you see and what you don't see. What you see right now on campus is overwhelmingly threatening. You are getting, again, through social media, the amplification of the worst overreaches of campus protests, the most threatening stuff that's materializing on campus. Again, there are reasons why the algorithms are going to curate the most extreme expressions of those types of behaviors on campus. That's one thing that you're seeing. And in the same column, you're seeing universities extremely confused right now about how to message. This is an own goal that I think will change because universities, basically following George Floyd, started thinking that they had to issue statements about everything, and now they're stuck. So I think the best thing that could possibly happen is that these universities are like, we have decided we're no longer in the statement putting out business. because there's no way out of that problem. So that's one version of the story that we're getting from the universities. The story we're not seeing, for all sorts of reasons from the universities, is that Jewish student attendance at Hillels is higher than it has ever been. Hillel professionals who are not trying to fight on social media and who are not trying to lead protests on campus are doing unbelievably heroic work to support Jewish students right now, to create really powerful environments for Jewish students. On the campuses that have not erupted, the campuses have figured out we are responsible for one thing, which is education, and you actually could do extraordinary educational work on these campuses. This has happened. I did a panel, various political positions at CUNY in New York, at Baruch, at Princeton, at Columbia, at Dartmouth. There's been like really interesting educational work where professors lowered the temperature by actually talking to each other. That stuff is just not getting press, but I think it's the role of Jewish community leaders and philanthropists to actually fuel that work and figure out a way to raise it up and to help us. How you solve the first column of the political nightmares on campus is a very different strategy than how do you actually support and endorse that campuses are safe, supportive environments for Jewish students to be. I don't think solving one necessarily fixes the other. I think they actually need two different strategies.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was amazing. I can tell you, Yehuda, I am all over the moral map. And now I know a word. I am a doom scroller. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in this room that are also doom scrollers, sadly. But I feel better now that I've heard you talk. So I want to say thank you to everybody in this room for coming. And I owe a really big thank you to our associated staff. Sarah Jacobs is incredible, and there are a lot. There are a lot of associated staff in this room that are working so hard overtime. So thank you all for doing that. On behalf of the Associated and the Inside Israel Forum, it's great to all be here in this room, even if we're here talking about stuff that is tearing our hearts apart. So what can you do to help? You can stay informed. Following this program, you're going to receive an email with more information. There you go, about the forum's new webinar series. It starts this Friday at noon, and it's called Israel War, The Full Picture. It's a panel conversation that will shed light on the issues of anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism on college campuses, amplified by the current war in Israel. You're invited to engage in critical conversations with experts on the front lines with Israel, with the Israel on Campus Coalition, Hillel International, Jewish on Campus, and our own local Hillel staff. The links to register for this webinar and those upcoming webinars are also on the back of your programs tonight. We encourage you to show solidarity with Israel with various signs and ribbons and bracelets. Thank you, Harriet. How many of us have our bracelets on tonight? There we go. You can pick up your ribbons tonight in the lobby. You can also get them in the lobbies of both of our JCCs. Friday night, please consider lighting an extra Shabbat candle, as I've been doing in honor of the victims and to bring some light into the darkness. Sorry. Finally, we'd like to share how you can donate to the Associated's Emergency for Israel Fund. The emergency funds go directly to our immediate needs, to our partners in Israel on the ground, including mattresses for the bomb shelters, cell phone chargers, and tablets for virtual education, trauma relief, and so much more. If you've made your gift to the Associated's annual campaign, thank you so much. If you haven't, please consider making it tonight. When crisis has hit Israel, the Associated's annual campaign ensures a swift response like we did for this critical time. It's how our on-the-ground partners have been able to respond immediately and effectively to the growing needs in Israel today. Now more than ever, your donation means so much to us. Every new gift and every increase will be matched by the Pearlstone Family Foundation, and that's pretty incredible. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Yehuda. Thank you, everybody, for being present tonight. We look forward to seeing you on other Insight Israel programs. Thank you.